In the previous video, we engaged in a brief analysis of a Middle Kingdom date for the Exodus, as presented in the documentary Patterns of Evidence and the works of David Rohl. While this position shares some of the same concerns as those I have raised in this series, at this point I am not persuaded that the Middle Kingdom is the appropriate time in Egypt's history to look for evidence of the Exodus. As such, I will proceed in this series assuming a traditional early date, during the 18th dynasty as the most likely for the Exodus. Given everything we have looked at so far, we are now in a position to ask one of the most important questions a student of the Bible and ancient Egypt can. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? There are four main assumptions I will be using to offer my opinion. Number 1, the variant readings of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 support 480 and 440 years prior to Solomon as round numbers. For our purposes, a time period of roughly 1450 to 1400 BC. Number 2, a standard deviation of roughly 5 to 50 years in the dates of traditional Egyptian chronology. Number 3, that the Exodus resulted in Egypt's inability to exercise economic and military control of the Levant. And number 4, that the Habiru of the Amarna letters refer, at least in part, to the Israelite conquest during the reign of Akhenaten. For substance to any of these assumptions, please refer to the earlier videos of this series. Before we go any further, though, we should discuss another important assumption: that the body of the pharaoh was lost in the Yam Suf, the Red Sea. I realize that this is a frequent point of argument when attempting to identify the pharaoh of the Exodus, so I wanted to take a minute to address it. I believe that there is enough in the Exodus account to support Pharaoh being drowned in the sea along with his army. Egyptian custom would have been for the pharaoh to personally lead his troops, so I think it's fair to consider the reference to all of Pharaoh's army having perished as including him also. This leads many to believe that Pharaoh's body would have been irretrievably lost. However, Exodus chapter 14 verse 30 states that Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. The question that would arise from this is whether or not Pharaoh's body would have been among those that washed up on the shore. I cannot give a definitive answer either way. There is enough ambiguity in Exodus chapter 14, though, for us to at least consider the possibility that Pharaoh's body could have been recovered as one that washed up on the shore. Thus, a common objection that, since we have the body of the pharaoh, he can't be the pharaoh of the Exodus, may not necessarily be true. In presenting this video, I will therefore try to be open to either possibility: that Pharaoh's body was recovered posthumously, or that it was irretrievably lost in the sea. With that being said, let's now begin to narrow our search. The variant readings of 1 Kings 6:1 point us to approximately 1450 to 1400 BC as the time of the Exodus events. Acknowledging 480 and 440 respectively to be round numbers, there may even be room to extend this time period to roughly 1460 to 1390 BC, although I admit that may be pushing the issue. When we examine the traditional chronologies of Egyptian history, 3 pharaohs emerge as reigning in or around these dates: Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV. These pharaohs are bookended by Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III. Right away, we can rule out Hatshepsut, since the biblical text consistently refers to Pharaoh as a man, Hatshepsut being a female pharaoh. The current dates for the remaining candidate pharaohs are as follows: Thutmose III, 1458 to 1425 BC, Amenhotep II, 1427 to 1397 BC, Thutmose IV, 1397 to 1388 BC, and Amenhotep III, 1388 to 1351 BC. By these dates, the strongest candidate for the 480 years of the Masoretic reading of 1 Kings 6:1 is Thutmose III. The range of standard chronological deviation would make Amenhotep II a plausible alternative according to this reading. In contrast, Amenhotep II is the strongest candidate for the 440 years of the Septuagint's reading. Thutmose IV is a plausible alternative even by conventional dates, with standard chronological deviation only strengthening his case. Amenhotep III, though an outlier by traditional dates, could be considered a second alternative by chronological deviation. Now that we have established the likelihood of each pharaoh being that of the Exodus by chronology, let's examine the state of Egypt during each of their reigns for evidence of economic and military weakness. Even though an exact interpretation of the 480 years of the Masoretic reading of 1 Kings 6:1 lands during the reign of Thutmose III, we can almost immediately rule him out as the pharaoh of the Exodus. The reason is that Thutmose III is arguably the strongest ruler in all of ancient Egyptian history. Rather than there being evidence of weakness in the wake of his reign, Egypt is at the height of its imperial power and influence. If the Exodus occurred at the end of his reign, Egypt would not be as strong and wealthy as it was. Amenhotep II has historically been a popular candidate for those advocating an early date of the Exodus. Reason being that the high chronology of Egypt has typically placed him on the throne during the year 1446 BC, the date supported by an exact interpretation of 1 Kings 6:1 in the Masoretic. Even in the current chronology, he does have the support of the exact interpretation of the Septuagint's reading. The first 2 years of his reign were a co-regency with his father, Thutmose III, which further rules out Thutmose III as the Exodus pharaoh. An interesting point to consider is that his successor, Thutmose IV, does not appear to have been in line for the throne upon Amenhotep II's death, as evidenced by the dream stela erected between the paws of the Great Sphinx of Giza. Advocates of Amenhotep II as the Exodus pharaoh point to this as substance that Amenhotep II lost his firstborn son, as described in Exodus chapter 12, verse 29. When we examine the state of Egypt in the wake of his reign, however, we find that Egypt's power and influence has not diminished. This is substantiated by the treaty that Thutmose IV established with the king of the Mitanni, Artatama I, to fix Egypt's northern border. If the Exodus occurred at the end of the reign of Amenhotep II, it is unlikely that Egypt would be economically or militarily strong enough to have negotiated this. For this reason, despite his popularity for some, I do not believe Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. The reign of Thutmose IV is considered by some Egyptologists as the height of Egypt's imperial power, because of the aforementioned treaty with the Mitanni. As mentioned in part 6 of this series, though, some interesting circumstances take place following his time on the throne. To recap, the death of Thutmose IV was apparently premature. Examination of his mummy has led scholars to assume a time of death between 25 and 28 years of age, free from indications of disease or other trauma. However, a curious observation is that he was emaciated at the time of his death. For whatever reason, Thutmose IV was not eating well in his last days. Given that there are no other signs of disease, perhaps he was under a large amount of stress, as one would expect of the pharaoh who witnessed God's wrath poured out in the destruction of Egypt during the 10 plagues. It's in the wake of his reign that Egypt begins losing control of its Levantine territories during the reign of his successor, Amenhotep III, ultimately resulting in the subjugation of Egypt's number one ally, the kingdom of the Mitanni, by the Hittites during the reign of his grandson, Akhenaten. It is unlikely that Thutmose IV could be considered as a candidate by even a round reading of 1 Kings 6:1 in the Masoretic. However, he is a very good candidate by a round reading of the Septuagint. Another interesting point is that if Thutmose IV is the pharaoh of the Exodus, The duration of Amenhotep III's reign is between 37 and 38 years, the amount of time Israel wandered in the desert before the first generation of Israelites passed away. It's in the wake of Amenhotep III's 38 years of rule that the mentions of the Habiru in Canaan appear during the reign of Akhenaten, which would match up quite well with Joshua's conquest. For these reasons, I believe a strong case can be made for Thutmose IV being the pharaoh of the Exodus. Amenhotep III's case is the most unlikely based on chronology. His best bet in this regard is as a second alternate for the Septuagint reading. However, the circumstances of his reign are attractive for similar reasons as they are for Thutmose IV. Egypt becomes increasingly weak during this time, and his son's reign would roughly coincide with the time of the conquest under Joshua. A weakness for his candidacy, though, is that these events happened prior to his death. If the Exodus took place during his reign, this would mean that he did not perish in the sea crossing. However, let me propose a possible resolution to this. Recall that the premature death of Thutmose IV likely meant that Amenhotep III ascended to the throne as a child. If this were the case, he would be pharaoh in title only, as Egypt would be ruled by intermediaries until he matured enough to rule of his own accord. Perhaps, then, it's possible that one of Thutmose IV's viziers was the acting pharaoh during this time. If the Exodus occurred during the early years of Amenhotep III, while he was a child, it may have been this hypothetical official who was the pharaoh of the Exodus. This is all speculative, but if one is going to propose Amenhotep III's reign as the time of the Exodus, I think this is the most reasonable way to accord it with the historical record. Given everything we examined, I will offer two proposals for the pharaoh of the Exodus. The first being in the event that the pharaoh's body was recovered, and the second being that it was lost in the sea crossing. If the pharaoh's body was recovered, then my pick for the pharaoh of the Exodus is Thutmose IV. Prior to his reign, Egypt is powerful and stable. In the wake of his reign, Egypt quickly becomes weak and impotent. The record of Amenhotep III's reign and the Amarna letters during the reign of Akhenaten accord well with the biblical narrative and make for synchronisms that don't work with any other proposed pharaoh. If the pharaoh's body was lost, then I would suggest that a ruling intermediary during the early years of Amenhotep III's reign was the pharaoh of the Exodus. I believe that the synchronisms we see with the end of Thutmose IV's reign are too strong to be pushed forward beyond the early years of Amenhotep III. This means, though, that he would have been a child and likely not acting as pharaoh for some time. The result is that another individual was the acting pharaoh in this sequence of events, and it would have been this person who met their demise in the Exodus. Of these two ideas, I favor the former because the latter relies on speculation. However, I don't believe the latter can be ruled out due to the possibility that the pharaoh's body was lost in the sea. For the purposes of organizing a timeline, I will regard the Exodus as the event that resulted in the death of Thutmose IV. With this recognition, we can propose a timeline of events for the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt through the beginning of the time of the Judges. The next question then becomes, who was the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites? We will offer some proposals in the next video. Please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you will be notified when I release the upcoming videos in this series. For further reading on this subject, I recommend Let My People Go by Stephen Collins. You will find a link to this book in the description.